Well, how about a band that only lasted 2 years, guys? Because that's the
Right.
bio I got this week. And that is the ballad of Op Ivy, Operation Ivy. You know, the Op Ivy for the cool kids,
Hmm.
right? Operation Ivy for the full ones. Josh and I spent a fair amount of time trying to figure out which of the many, many tracks on this album we were going to put in the various slots. And I'm trying to I remember the tracks. I'm just trying to remember where I put I believe in the opening montage, did we put help me out, Josh. I
Take warning.
apologize. Take warning, yes.
Yep.
And you're now going to listen to
Sound system.
Sound System.
Sounds just gonna bring me back up, yeah. One day that I can't stand up. Sounds just gonna bring me back up, right? One day that I can't stand up. Try to describe it to the limit of my ability. And stay out for a second, then I'm giving up what it used to be. Containing music somehow more than just sound. Inspiration comes in to secret around us.
Correct. Thank you, Josh. I blanked a little bit in terms of the order that they were going on. I didn't want to misspeak, so you didn't have to edit right there. So, Operation Ivy, a seminal ska punk band,
Yes.
probably the seminal ska punk band,
The
I would
founding
say.
father.
The pretty much close to the founding fathers of this, yes. Obviously, two members of this band break off and form another extremely famous band, Rancid, as well. That was going to come in here, and we'll talk about a little bit of where that goes as well. But
Oh, okay. I didn't know that.
no,
I didn't know
yes.
that. I was like, this sounds like
Well,
Rancid. That's why.
for people like Matt who may not have known this, that
Wait, what's
there's all
going
kinds of
on?
other stuff you might know. Yeah, like Epitaph Records. We have to probably explain that one to you. That like a member
what
of
day is
Bad
today?
Religion and Tim
Oh,
Armstrong. Yep.
John, we didn't do numbers.
Oh yeah.
Go for numbers.
Numbers.
Too much
Operation
revelation
Ivy's.
for you.
That's right. My mind is blown. Energy by Operation Ivy comes in at number 410 in the 1980s on Best Ever Albums, number 36 in 1989, number 2,615 of all time. Of course, it's Operation Ivy's highest rated album because it's their only one. And they are ranked number 1,577 of overall artist rankings on Best Ever Albums. Not on Rolling Stone's list either.
Gotcha. So there's an overall Operation Ivy bio, which is relatively short because they're formed in May of 1987, and then they break up, I should say, in May of 1989. So they have an exact 2 year lineage. The band members themselves have interesting backgrounds, though. I should probably tell you who the band members are. The band members are Jesse Michaels, who's on lead vocals, Tim Armstrong, who's on guitar and vocals. He is one of the members, Matt, for your sake, who ends up forming Rancid, along with Matt Freeman. He's the bassist, and he's the third vocalist in the group. And then there's Dave Mello on the drums. And before they formed Rancid after this, actually everybody but Michaels forms a band in between this band ending and Rancid forming as well. So one of the things you need to know about this band is that they all are in the Berkeley area. So Berkeley, California informs a lot of the vibe of them. And it informs the politics of the band, which are very clear in the lyrical content of this. And as you might imagine, for some folks that grew up in Berkeley, California, they lean left, shall we say, in terms of their political looks. Jesse Michaels, when Operation Ivy is formed in 1987, is all of 18 years old. He grew up going to shows throughout his teenage years, which makes him somewhat similar to me because I did the same thing going through, but I never formed a band like this, so he had me beat on that. But he was the son of a professor. That was his mother, and a professor and writer, which was his father. So he's a university kid. And from an early age, early 80s, right, he was going to shows in Berkeley. And just heavily involved in the punk rock scene. While this is happening, you've got Tim Armstrong, who was born in 1965. So when this band officially breaks in 87, he's 22. So 18 years old for one and 22 for Tim Armstrong. So they're young guys when this is going on. And his early life is pretty similar. The difference is that he's gigging in bands, a band called Basic Radio and some other things around the same time, but he's going to a lot of the same shows that Michaels is going to. And for that matter, so is Freeman, the bassist. So they're all basically scene kids, and as is wont to do, they kind of come together and they form a band. And they are linked to a very famous club in Berkeley called 924 Gilman Street. That is there's a lot of bands that can be tied to that. It was sort of like an all ages place that was sort of built on inclusion and openness, kind of tied more to punk and ska probably more than others. And the reason is that it kind of was created to be a less toxic version, right, of the scene, I would say, than like the hardcore scene or a lot of the stuff we talked about in that, where there was the violence or the skinheads and stuff like that. So this was sort of designed to be like an all ages antidote to that. And another band that was famously a part of that scene was Green Day. They played there, but a lot of the people in that punk rock scene of Northern California came out of that, and Operation Ivy definitely came out of that, and that is where they started gigging shortly after forming, and got a rabid fan base there. They did sort of an EP called Hectic that was released the same year that they were formed. And they went on tour that same year. So they're doing all of this like very quickly, much like a lot of punk bands, right? They have a DIY ethos, surprise, surprise. And yeah, they there's just all kinds of interesting stuff, like in terms of their lineage as the forefathers of this. Jesse Michaels co-wrote all of the music to the song 2000 Light Years Away by Green Day. I don't know how well you guys know that. I never knew that in a million years. So I thought that was very interesting too. But that it's kind of interesting because they form, they play, they eventually build to this album, and right as this album's released and they're getting buzz for it, they break up. And that's kind of like how the band just ends. Some things that might be interesting for you guys to know. They're named after a nuclear weapons testing program from 1952. That's where Operation Ivy comes in. And really, as much as I read about Operation Ivy, a lot of it is kind of about how passionate the members were and their origin as fans of the music and coming together. But in terms of as a group and their moments, it really kind of comes down to this. They record a track on a compilation called Maximum Rock and Roll called Turn It Around. They signed to Lookout Records, and I probably should mention Lookout Records because they are a independent record label that's specifically focused on punk. They released a ton of like Northern California bands, and later all of said bands pretty much left because they never were paid royalties for their music, Operation Ivy included. They took a little longer than most, but they kind of ended up releasing a second compilation amount of tracks to kind of get back some of their royalties. But their golden years, Lookout Records, was considered to be like 1993 to 1997. That is where shortly after they did the early Green Day albums like 1,000 Hours and Slappy and Kerplunk and all those, they did Rancid's first album, not An Out Come the Wolves, but their first one. And then in the mid 90s, they may not have had any albums as big as those, but they're releasing tons and tons of albums. They end up changing leadership from one of the co-founders, Larry Livermore, and they get taken over by a guy named Chris Applegren and his wife, a woman named Molly Newman. And suddenly a lot of the bands start leaving. Probably the one band in the late 90s that you would be aware of that signed on the album is the group The Donnas. I don't know how familiar you guys are with them.
Yeah, definitely.
I was rocking with The Donnas. Take It Off, I think, is probably New Kid in School. They're the probably the two biggest tracks I could think of from them. And then later, this one for you, Josh, in the early 2000s, two bands I was aware of who signed were Pretty Girls Make Graves, which is a Smith song, but it was also a band, and Ted Leo and the Pharmacists.
Oh, yeah.
Were on.
Makes sense.
Yep. But on August 1st, 2005, Green Day and Operation Ivy and some of the other big bands on it, like Screeching Weasel, the Lillingtons, and stuff like that, announced that they just rescinded the master rights for their Lookout Records material. They all cited breach of contract for unpaid royalties, and basically the album, the record label had to fold because of that. So, but obviously, you know, that's a good reason for a record label to fold when they can't pay anybody anymore. So that's how that ended. So, but it is important to know that for a while they were a seminal punk record label, and Operation Ivy were one of the biggest acts on them, along with Green Day. I'd say were probably the two big ones.
Yeah.
So while they're on this Lookout Records, as I mentioned before, they do a 7-inch called Hectic. They are playing the scene pretty much locally, but they're going to big cities is pretty much where, when they branch out, right, they're going to, because that's where they can find the follow. But in many ways, it's kind of similar to like how hardcore was, right? They'd play in their area and then occasionally go to big cities with other hardcore groups playing, and that's kind of the same vibe here. In mid-1988, they begin playing larger venues. They sort of are getting pressured to join a major label. EMI notably gives them a major label deal, and pretty much they're stuck and they're not sure what to do. They release Energy on Lookout and kind of that's in March 1989, this album, and they try to figure out what's going on. And instead of signing with the major label in true punk rock fashion, guys, what do? They break up 2 months later in May because they did not want to compromise their intentions, as they put it.
Wow.
Their last in a great piece of synchronicity, the group's last performance live was on May 28th, 1989. This was also the band Green Day's first performance with the name Green Day at 924 Gilman Street on the same show. So
wow.
how about that? It was supposed to be Operation Ivy's record release party, and instead was, for all intents and purposes, the funeral for the band. So they do one more unofficial performance in a backyard like get together for family and friends, and then they are done. In the 2 years together, if you want a sort of a post-mortem here, they performed 185 shows and recorded a total of 32 songs. That is the output of the band. And since then, they have not formally ever reunited. However, interestingly enough, after years of not saying it, in 2013, Michaels and Armstrong, the two primary members of the group, although Armstrong used a nom de plume in this, Tim Timebomb, which made me laugh, recorded a song together, and that was sort of a thing. But then in March 2023, Armstrong and Michaels came together with the Circle Jerks drummer, Joey Castillo, to form the band Bad Optics and released a single, and they eventually changed their name to Doom Regulator. So in theory, the two main members of Op Ivy are back to being in a band with the Circle Jerks drummer, which I found very interesting. That had actually slipped past my purview before I did the research for this. So I was like, well, how about that? And so I might go search out some of their music this weekend if time presents. So I tried to stretch this out a little bit, like, because I didn't want to do it a disservice, but a lot of Op Ivy's sort of the reason we're covering them is because after they were done, my gosh, their effect on like 90s ska and punk is gigantic. I mean, everybody and their uncle covered a Op Ivy song. In case you're wondering who covered them in the 90s, guys, you've got Real Big Fish, the Blue Me's, the Cherry Poppin' Daddies, the Aquabats, Goldfinger, Green Day, you name it. Like, everybody covered Op Ivy in the 90s. And pretty much they were a constant name drop amongst everybody in all of these scenes, right? So, like, you basically could not have listened to 90s ska or punk, or ska punk for that matter, without hearing Operation Ivy listed as a seminal influence. So, and that is really what their legs are, to the fact that I think Josh is saying yup a lot, because I think he listened to some of the same music I did, and they resided in the same area. So we kind of know, not know how we feel about this, but know that Josh and I are familiar with this. Matt's obviously going into this cold, because this was not his scene or his movement. I'm interested to hear what he thinks about this because unlike a lot of stuff that's ska tinged or punk tinged, I don't have as much of an idea about how Matt feels about the ska punk fusion.
fusion.
So, the fusion, exactly. What do you think, Matt?
All right. I overall, it's probably of the ska that we have covered. This is probably the I would probably listen to this more than the specials or some of the other ska stuff. See, some of the ska stuff that we covered, like Fishbone, that I don't know, like it's ska light, like there's ska elements.
So
but
let's do a inventory for people that
right.
may be listening. We've covered the specials, which
The
was
Harder They
two-tone.
Come soundtrack.
We covered the Harder They Come soundtrack,
Right.
which is more
Yeah.
like first gen ska. We
Right.
covered the English Beat, which was part ska but also clearly pop rock.
Yeah, I was
say
okay,
I would say
right.
Madness would be the same, right? They were part
Yeah.
pop and part ska for sure. And then we covered Fishbone, which ska was one of like 5 genres. And then of course we covered that one song by Paul Simon, Mother and Child Reunion, which shockingly had some ska elements too. So yes.
Yeah. So I've it's probably not a surprise. I like the punk themed songs better than the ska themed songs, and as such, I probably like the first half of this record better than the second half because I was finding more. I think as the album went on, you were getting more of the ska sound than you did earlier on. Earlier on, I thought like there was some really strong stuff on there that I really liked, and it actually reminded me some of the songs of a band that came later, but there was the Offspring. I was hearing like a very, some of the riffs of like, I think particularly like Jaded and The Crowd, like that, those riffs and like the guitars part there, not necessarily the vocals obviously, but I was like, I could see, actually Jaded sound like Smash, like the last track on the first Offspring record. It's almost like, man, should the Offspring give them a little bit of money for that, because it's a very similar, to me it was a very similar guitar riff. So a lot of the punk stuff I liked, right? It's obvious, of course it's upbeat, it's I could see why this is massively popular, and early on, like they're throwing in some of the ska. Sound System was a ska. I did know that song, and so I'm okay with that. I kind of like Sound System. I liked what is it? Unity was a good, probably a better blend of like the rock and the ska, because there was like definitive parts that I was
Probably
like, okay,
their biggest song, I'd say, their biggest hit.
Was it?
That or
Okay.
Sound System, yeah.
Okay, so that to me was like, okay, here's the rock part, now they're going to do the ska. So because a lot of these songs
Knowledge
are like
too. Knowledge, yeah, Knowledge is a big song too. Yep.
not right. But I kind of, a lot of these songs, there were some songs that had like pretty much the majority of it's ska, the majority of it's punk, a little bit of elements here. To me, something like Unity had a good meld of both. So it's kind of like differentiating, like, oh, where's the ska, where's the punk, and kind of like that. So because I like the punk better. So I'm probably overall thumbs in the middle here. I think that there's some definitely things that I gravitated towards and that I liked. To me, the record, it's only 34 minutes or whatever, but it's almost like, by the time that all the ska comes towards the end, you're losing me a little bit. It's almost too much. So I would probably break this up a little bit more for me. But the punk elements, I can certainly see where the influence comes later on. Some of those other bands that you're mentioning, like I'm a huge I love Green Day, and they're much more of a pop punk band. Like they're a very catchy, very melodic punk band, and there's elements of that in this album too. This is an edgier record than what Green Day did, generally speaking, and it's but there's a lot more edge, but there's still the melody in here as well, which I liked. I thought Bad Town was kind of an interesting song, because I was trying to be like, what is that punk or is that ska? And I'm like, I don't know what it sounds like, something off of
It's both.
The answer, of course, is yes. Yes, Matt. There you go.
Yeah, that was probably the best melding of it, because that was just like, I couldn't, because a lot of the other ones I could put my finger on and say, this is more this than that. That sounded like that belonged on London Calling. That was a very London Calling-esque type song that I heard. So yeah, as far as me, a genre that I'm not really, we've done enough now. I'm not going to be a convert and be like, I love ska. I think there's elements of it that I appreciate. It's certainly it's fun to see live. Like I've seen a couple of bands do this live, and I'm like, yeah, okay, there's a lot of energy there, man, and people that love this stuff, and so I can appreciate that. It's probably not something that I'm going to be putting on, but there were some cool songs on here that I could see myself putting on a playlist or whatever, that going back to. So I'm going to go solid thumbs in the middle for me, kind of splitting that up right there. But I think. Maybe for all the other ska, because the beat, I forgot about the beat. I remember liking that album more than I thought. So I would probably say off the top of my head, like it would probably be a cross between either this or the beat in terms of the more ska albums that, like more pure ska albums that I appreciated or enjoyed more, or even potentially could go back to. But so yeah, I'm thumbs in the middle, and now I will let you guys rave about this album and tell me that I should like it more than I do.
Well, now you know where a million other bands come from, at least, so you can fill that history in the family tree. So now you can name check them when somebody says, "Oh, this so and so." Less Than Jake would be the band that I don't know. It's hard for me to overstate how important this band is and influential to like my early music tastes, because pretty much any band I listened to was influenced by them or name checked them directly. And so that's kind of where I'm coming from. It's like listening to this album is listening to I don't know, like a looking at a family album or something, in terms of kind of just familiarity with the sound and having a nostalgic place in my heart for it. And Less Than Jake was one of my favorite bands growing up. They are directly sound like them in a lot of ways. The incorporation here between just the way that they fuse the ska and punk together, basically all of West Coast punk, basically any punk compilation album that I listen to, or
Punkorama 1 through 6, and Give 'Em the Boot, and every one of them.
All of those come from this. Goldfinger, I don't know, I could just name a million bands, but the kind of left-leaning politics in the lyrics mixed with the speed and kind of energy of the sound with the the ska guitar and the pick it up, pick it up, pick it up. I've heard that refrain a million times in a million different ways. The bringing in the saxophone in like a song like Bad Town, and even something on the backside like Freeze Up is just they're just an example of, I guess, what I responded to as a teenager and what I really like about it. And it's I can't really say anything bad about this album because every song is like 2 minutes, which is another thing that I like, and it just makes its statement. I can see why it had such a rabid following and when they were around, and just kind of the joy and energy that it brings, and is what I like about it. So thumbs up for me for sure.
Yeah, it's similar, John. I mean, I was not just hewn in right to the ska and punk lane. It was a big part of my teenage years for sure. I spent as much time at shows that sounded like this as any other genre, but I wasn't as exclusively hemmed into it, I think, as much as many people in the scene. So I kind of was an interesting spot where I knew the evangelist, but I wasn't a total evangelist. I just really liked it and identified with it. I always have kind of said that Op Ivy is sort of the link between The Clash and the bands like that and the 90s, right? Op Ivy's the link that does it. There's other bands that were playing ska in this era, right? Like the Toasters come to mind and people like that, but they were more directly influenced by two-tone ska. This comes from sort of a different area than I know they were fans of two-tone ska, don't get me wrong, but you don't see the direct lineage because two-tone ska was informed by first wave, first wave ska, second wave ska. I'm mixing up terms, right? But the two-tone is the second wave ska, right? So that was, reggae, upbeat there, slowed down, occasionally speeding it up, but more, that reggae Jamaica looking focus, right? This kind of comes from a little bit of that, but also punk rock, right? In a way more direct lineage. And so from that end of things, it does sound different, and like you took the blueprint and added to it. But the reason I think it's such a jarring listen is because we're listening to it in our journey in 1989, right? And this is a sound
Yeah.
that defines the 90s for a lot of people, right? Because that's what it presents itself. And it also presents itself in the punk rock that becomes mainstream in the 90s and the third wave ska revival that comes in. And then it's funny because like from the ashes you've got Rancid, which becomes a commercial version of this, right? And they're releasing like Ruby Soho and Time Bomb and Roots Radicals, which could have been on this album, right? It's just they came later with a different coat of paint in an era that was waiting to listen to them. And yeah, and like you said, Josh, I mean, the amount of compilation albums I heard with just different groups that are doing different variations of this, like bands, it seemed like almost everybody was doing an Op Ivy redux in their own way, leaning into a part of what their sound is. But I agree with you, Matt. Like, there's the album gets ska heavier as it goes along. It's always there, but it kind of tails into mostly ska at the end. So it doesn't, I think, wear on me the way it does for you, because it feels like you're coming to the end of the show, right? And so, like, what are you going to play at the end of it? You're going to kind of cool down a little bit, right, with the ska songs. And, you know, there's, for as much as you tend to like sort of the anthemic rock of people that grew up listening to punk rock and ska, right? And then just kind of took it. And songs like Take Warning and Unity and stuff are songs that are right out of that playbook, I feel like. So I'm actually a little bit surprised those didn't pop off to you a little bit more, because if you listen to like Take Warning, for example, Matt, it seems to be built like how you do. There's an anthemic nature to that. Like, and this
Warning,
music, by the
that it's interesting that song to me was just repetitive, like that whole, like, the repetitive down 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 down,
well, it's reggae
like
influenced.
over and over again, and it didn't, that line there, it didn't. See, it's one of those things that, like, that part didn't do much for me, and then they do it over and over again, and so, like, I don't really care for that song, actually.
Okay.
So,
Interesting.
because of that,
I feel like it's a song that like Frank Turner would take and just turn into like his own thing just by speeding it up a little bit and adding a few more words.
Yeah, maybe.
That's how it
I
has
mean,
me
maybe if
tonight.
they said it, but it's just the way that it was presented there, it didn't really connect with me.
By the way, we haven't mentioned Sublime, which is another act that like clearly was influenced by this group. So I'll just throw that in there because, you know, that song and a couple others like Sound
No
System
Doubt.
and stuff. Yeah, No Doubt's a little bit more like new wave and stuff built into it as well, maybe. And if you listen to like early No Doubt albums, it veers a little bit more out of this than maybe a lot of. It's not as much of a direct lineage outside of the fact that they both like a lot of the same bands. They're in the same scene, don't get me wrong, but they're not the first that comes to mind to me, because they're really kind of not as tied to like punk in my mind, No Doubt, as much as some of the other ones. They come from a different lane. So, but yeah, I this one's a thumbs up for me, because how could it not be? It's the template for all that came after it to some degree, and I really like the sound, and yeah, I just think it's very interesting that we covered this one the same week we covered Nine Inch Nails, because, you know, I've long said that like industrial is kind of what ska is for Matt, and it's going to be interesting for me to talk about Nine Inch Nails, because it's going to be a similar type of conversation. Like, how do you feel in this type of music you don't normally love? And I'll hold off on my take on that till we get there. But yeah, so we'll just keep exposing ourselves to it and see where it leads. But yeah, it's not a hard one to guess that Josh and I were going to like this one.
Yeah. An
This is
earlier
sort of
band that
crack
we-
cocaine.
Yes, definitely. An earlier band that we've talked about that is probably Op Ivy probably listened to was like the Descendants, because they're also California like punk rock, and that was always like, that always seemed very clear in my mind when listening to that Descendants album at Milo Goes to College, and then hearing this.
Absolutely. Oh, without a doubt. Like, they would have played, if Op Ivy had been around longer, they would have probably had, but the Descendants had a quick, and much like the Descendants, a couple of these guys went to college and got like degrees in things like literature, you know, and it's kind of like, they just, because they did all this young, right? They then moved on to their mid-20s, which is so funny to think of, because most bands don't do that. They don't just tap out when they turn 23 or 24 years old. So, yep.
Yeah, they
So-
covered the Nancy Sinatra song on here. That was the song I knew
Yeah.
that boots me.
Well, I don't know if
And,
they covered it. I think they gave a spin to it, right? It's like it's got
Oh, is
elements
that-
of these. Yeah.
Oh,
it's
okay.
Because the song they're kind of leaning into is "These boots were made for walking," but I think this song is called "One of These Days," right? Which is the second part of that chorus, right? One of these days, these boots are gonna walk all
So these
over.
boots are
Yeah.
made for walking. One of these days. Okay.
Yeah.
written,
So it's
yeah.
not a direct cover, but it's got
Okay.
wordplay that's similar. Yeah.
Nancy Sinatra just turned 83.
Yeah.
Happy.
For some
belated.
reason, that seems old. Like I thought, I wouldn't have thought that Frank Sinatra's daughter would have been 83 by now, but I guess she
Well,
is.
Frank Sinatra probably would be like 120 or
Yeah.
something. So
Yeah.
I'm not exaggerating either. I think he probably would be something like 115 or 120.
Frank Sinatra was born in 1915, so he'd be
So, it's
yeah,
19, so he'd be
he'd
108,
be 108.
years old.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Mhm.
Shit.
So that was a little high, but yeah, you get